Today, we're going to look at one of the great diplomatic failures in history, the policy of appeasement and the run-up to World War II. Appeasement, as just a general definition, is the policy of settling international quarrels by admitting and satisfying grievances through rational negotiation and compromise, thereby avoiding the resort to an armed conflict, which would be expensive, bloody, and dangerous. The term is most often applied to the foreign policy of the British Prime Minister Chamberlain towards Nazi Germany in the years before World War II broke out between 1937 and 1939. Generally, the term just means discussing and resolving issues by conceding a little bit to other people's demands instead of just going to war. After 10 million deaths in World War I, many countries were determined to prevent any future conflict at any cost. In the 1920s, the League of Nations tried to follow this idea of collective security, the idea that countries could act together to discourage aggression, and if necessary, act together to stop aggressors. This was not super successful, and it proved hard for all the countries in the League to agree upon a common policy. As a result, a second idea was considered, and that idea is called, generally, appeasement. Appeasement was the policy adopted by Britain during the 1930s. This policy developed from the growing belief that some countries, especially Nazi Germany, had been unfairly treated in the peace settlement of 1918 to 1919, in other words, in the Treaty of Versailles. When Germany began to demand aggressively that some terms of the Versailles Treaty could be thrown out, some people argued that this was only right. If their grievance could be settled by negotiation, it would avoid the need for war. And after all, everybody remembered the trenches. Nobody wanted to live through that again. And no politician wanted to be the person who sent people back there. Once they were appeased in this way, they would act the same as any other country in foreign affairs. In other words, maybe if we give in to Germany's demands, which seem like they might be reasonable, they will act like a normal state and negotiate in the future. This policy was used in the 30s to try to prevent both Italy and Germany from going to war to achieve their objectives. Some people, at the time and since, have described it as a policy of cowardice. But this is much too simple. The leaders who followed this policy believed they were overcoming real grievances and that it would help create a settled, peaceful Europe as the causes of aggression were removed. They may have been wrong, but that doesn't mean they were cowards. So in this lesson, we're going to look at appeasement, what it was, how it failed spectacularly, and to what extent it caused World War II. First thing you need to know, after World War I, territory was taken away from Germany, particularly here in the East, these countries outlined in red that became independent states following the Treaty of Versailles. One of the things that Germany wanted to do in the 1930s was get some of this land back for a couple of reasons. One, over here, there's some pretty good farmland, and Hitler's Germany wanted to be self-sufficient. Looking back at the blockades from World War I and how they caused hunger, one of the objectives of Nazi Germany was to not need to import anything from anyone in order to, survive and keep going, kind of with an eye to a future war. So, with some farmland from here, and the part that they didn't say very loudly, but also using the population here for slave labor to produce all the food for them, Germany would be more self-sufficient. The way they said it was they wanted self-determination. There were parts of these territories, especially towards the border with Germany, that spoke German primarily. And the argument was, Germans should be allowed to choose their own state. And if they want to join Germany, Nazi Germany, then they should. Throughout the 20s and 30s, there was this pattern that's crystal clear in hindsight, but at the time might not have been, of fascist countries growing increasingly aggressive and nationalist and feeling very comfortable taking more and more land. This happened in Japan as Japan started to expand Italy did the same thing, and then Nazi Germany followed suit. The problem was that a lot of people by this point had come to see the Treaty of Versailles as being maybe a little too harsh, maybe kind of unfair. Maybe the thought was, like, maybe it's reasonable for Germany to want some of that land back, especially given economic crisis, especially given that the Soviet Union is right there and we don't want it to expand. And so, like, as Germany started to demand different territories, the League of Nations did nothing and the Allies did nothing. The same thing happened with Italy. Italy conquered parts of Africa. The League of Nations did nothing to stop them. Japan began to expand into East Asia. The League of Nations did nothing to stop them either. So why would they stop Nazi Germany, was kind of the idea. The problem here, in large part, was that the people in the League of Nations, mostly the British and the French, were in no position to start another war. They didn't want the same things. And meanwhile, the United States was isolated, not in the League of Nations at all, not interested in intervening to potentially like resolve or maybe spark a new conflict in Europe. Similarly, growing fear of Stalin's Soviet Union, which seemed to be booming, encouraged many, far too many people in democratic countries to, if not support fascist aggression, maybe turn a blind eye to it. The calculation being that like maybe fascism's less bad than communism. After seizing power in Germany, Hitler made no secret about his goals. Right? He wanted to, and he publicized all of this. He wanted to recontrol the territories that Germany had lost to Versailles, such as the Rhineland over here that had been demilitarized, that was really important for industrial strength. It wanted to rearm military forces, which was forbidden by Versailles. He wanted to expand Germany's borders to provide what he called living space for his population. He wanted to unite all German-speaking people under the control of Nazi Germany. And he was ready to gamble that other European powers wouldn't want to go to war to stop him. And he was right. Before we keep going, let's have a refresher on what the Treaty of Versailles involved. Remember, the whole point of the Treaty of Versailles was to prevent Germany from starting another war of aggression and to make reparations for all of the damage and cost of that First World War. The main terms were Germany had to surrender its colonies to the League of Nations. It had to return a chunk of territory in the West, Alsace-Lorraine, to France. It had to cede land to Belgium, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, that's over here in the East. It had to give parts of East Prussia up here to Poland, which was a new state. Danzig over here was to become a free city. It had to allow occupation for the Saar over here. So like forces from the League of Nations, French mostly, were allowed to occupy this territory of Germany. It had to demilitarize the Rhineland, so no military personnel was allowed on this border. They had to pay reparations. There was a ban on the Union of Germany up here and Austria down here. They had to accept Germany's guilt for causing the war. There was a provision for the trial of the former Kaiser and the war leaders. And there were limitations to the German army, so they could only have 100,000 men with no conscription, so like no draft, no tanks, no heavy artillery, no poison gas supplies, seems like a good rule, no aircraft, no airships. The limitations on the German Navy meant that they could only have 100,000 ton or under vessels, which turns out not to be that big, no submarines. And Germany signed the treaty under protest. And the problems didn't stop there. The United States Congress refused to ratify the treaty, so that means like one of the biggest powers wasn't going to stand behind it. And lots of people in France and Britain were angry that there was no trial for the Kaiser, no trial for other war leaders, and like different provisions made different people really unhappy. As Hitler rose to power, he began piece by piece violating different terms of this treaty and, in large part, getting away with it. He was open about his refusal to accept lots of these terms, and as soon as he became chancellor, he began rearming the country, so breaking the restrictions placed on German armed forces. Then he sent troops into the Rhineland, this little area over here indicated by the 1. And in 1938, he joined Austria to Germany. So that's step 2 over here. It's 2 years before World War I starts. The next thing on his list was East. There's this part of Czechoslovakia that is shaded over here, and you can kind of see a heat map over here of like the German-speaking population. It's called the Sudetenland, and Hitler wanted it. He wanted to join it to Germany, kind of as a first step to taking the rest of Czechoslovakia. Also secretly, because this is terrain that is pretty difficult to get across if you are trying to like force an army that way. It's mountainous and stuff, but if he was allowed to just have it, that would put the line over the parts of the terrain that would be difficult to conquer, which is very convenient given that he was planning to conquer the rest of it. Anyway, he started demanding this part of Czechoslovakia because there were a lot of ethnic Germans there. And under the idea of self-determination, like even the Allies, according to their own values, said that people should choose their own government. The leader of Czechoslovakia, of course, was not thrilled with this idea, especially because if Hitler got his way, most of the Czech defenses would have been handed over to the Germans without a shot, and Czechoslovakia would be left defenseless. Hitler's plan here was risky because at the time the Czech army wasn't weak, it was pretty strong, but that part of the terrain was really important to their defense. The League of Nations, meanwhile, was kind of chilling, not doing much to prevent this conflict, and so it fell to Britain to try to stop this trend of Hitler undoing pieces of the Treaty of Versailles bit by bit. And this little bit of Czechoslovakia that we've been talking about, labeled in step 3, was the point of contention that set off some alarm bells. So, next, one of the greatest diplomatic failures in history. The British Prime Minister, his name's Chamberlain, he's right here looking very proud of himself. He flew to Munich, which is in Germany, to meet with Hitler to talk about these claims on that part of Czechoslovakia. At Munich, they agreed, without consulting the Czechs at all, that Hitler should have that part of Czechoslovakia, as long as he promised to stop making territorial claims. He agreed then to let Hitler annex those parts of Czechoslovakia that he wanted in exchange for a promise from Hitler, no more territorial demands to make in Europe. So what happened next? The German troops occupied that part of Czechoslovakia. Hitler got what he wanted without firing a shot. And Chamberlain went back home very proud of himself because he was convinced that he had just averted the next World War. He had visions of people dying in trenches in his mind when making this agreement. And so he very proudly came back to Britain, like waving this piece of paper that Hitler had signed, claiming, I've secured peace in our time, which of course he didn't. 6 months later, in March 1939, Hitler broke his promise, surprise, surprise, and sent German troops to take over the rest of Czechoslovakia. Then he signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, which just means like they agreed not to attack each other. And also secretly, they agreed to split up Poland between them. Then Hitler invaded Poland, and only then did the British decide to stand up to him and declare war. Hitler didn't think that Britain would go to war over Poland because Britain didn't go to war over Czechoslovakia. So that was kind of a surprise, but not one that he couldn't deal with. And as a result of all of this, like that deal between Chamberlain and Hitler in this Munich conference has been remembered as one of the biggest diplomatic mistakes in history, perhaps the mistake that started World War II. And this is what people think of when they think of appeasement, of giving into aggressors' demands to avoid conflict. In this case, it didn't work out at all. However, things are a little bit more complicated than they seem. To summarize where we've gotten so far, Hitler tossed the Treaty of Versailles. No one did anything about it, step by step. And while charming Neville Chamberlain with promises to act like a normal state and stop making claims on different states in Europe, Hitler, in fact, achieved his strategic objectives and set out to conquer the rest of Eastern Europe to the extent that he was able. Poland, as this little kitty cat reminds us, was the step too far that caused World War I to begin in Europe. So this all makes Chamberlain look really, really bad, like incredibly naive. It's important then to remember that at the time, things were less clear than they are now. Like, obviously now, nobody would make a deal with Hitler. At the time, though, it wasn't super clear if he was somebody who could potentially be reasoned with, or if he was actually going to pursue his agenda no matter what diplomatic agreements he made. At the time, too, you have to remember, like, the public generally, especially in Britain, was not super interested in going to another war. Remember how militarism worked out for them last time, 4 years in the trenches with nothing to show for it at the end. As Chamberlain said in 1939, how horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. Like, most British people probably couldn't pick out Czechoslovakia on the map. So after having gone through a world war where the idea was like a kid from Serbia shot the Archduke from Austria-Hungary, and then Russia moved some troops around, so Germany declared war on France. So now British people have to go die in trenches in France because they walked through Belgium. Like, you can't really pull that twice. So even if Chamberlain had wanted to stand up to Hitler, it's not clear that he would have actually had the support at home necessary to do it. On the other hand, the person who would take over after Chamberlain, Winston Churchill, saw the situation clearly for what it was. In his words, he says, "The word appeasement was not popular, but appeasement has its place in all policy. But make sure you put it in the right place. Appease the weak, defy the strong. Appeasement from strength is magnanimous and noble and might be the surest and perhaps the only path to world peace. When nations or individuals get strong, they are often truculent or stubborn and bullying. But when they are weak, they become better-mannered. But this is the reverse of what is healthy and wise. In other words, if you're going to choose appeasement to avoid war, do it with a state that can't actually fight you in a war, like Germany was able to at the time." Arguments for appeasement were popular at the time. As Chamberlain said, "However much we may sympathize with a small nation confronted by a big and powerful neighbor, we cannot in all circumstances undertake to involve the whole British Empire in war simply on her account. If we have to fight, it's got to be on larger issues than that. War is a fearful thing, and we must be very clear before we embark on it that it really is the greatest issue that are at stake." Reasons for appeasement included, like, Chamberlain was the prime minister of a democracy, and the people in Britain did not want war. He wasn't a dictator who could start war however he wanted, and he absolutely could not set Britain on a course for war without the support of the people. Also, it's true that Czechoslovakia was really far away from England. It was a brand new country after all. And so, like, how do you convince British soldiers to go die for something like that? A second reason for appeasement was the state of the British Army. In 1938, the British Army was weak. Britain needed time to rearm before going to war, and so they wouldn't have been much help to Czechoslovakia anyway if war had broken out right then. or so the argument goes. Another reason was communism. Lots of people in Britain saw Hitler as a defense against the spread of communism, and Chamberlain wanted a strong Germany to serve as a barrier against any sort of expansion by Stalin's Soviet Union. Next, the Treaty of Versailles. A lot of people thought that Germany had legitimate problems with the Treaty of Versailles, and Hitler's demands seemed reasonable at the time. World War I, too, was in the back of everybody's mind. It was still very much in living memory. And so the horror of the trenches was something that people remembered clearly and didn't want to repeat. And then finally, Hitler then versus our knowledge of Hitler now is very different. Our modern view of Hitler does not reflect how the Nazi dictator was seen in the late 1930s. At that point, there weren't Auschwitz didn't exist. Blitzkrieg hadn't happened yet. The concentration camps were not yet part of the public imagination. The British had already been dealing with one fascist, Mussolini, for years before Hitler took power. And so top British diplomats thought Hitler was kind of the way Mussolini was, more bravado than substance, somebody that could be negotiated with eventually. There were arguments against appeasement at the time, though. Although the vast majority of British people agreed with the policy of appeasement, some people very strongly disagreed, and one of them was Winston Churchill, who would, again, heroically lead Britain through World War II. Churchill believed Hitler could not be dealt with because his aims and objectives were not rational, so no amount of appeasement would actually satisfy the man. He wasn't alone in voicing concern. Churchill was a conservative. But weirdly, this is one circumstance where British communists agreed with him, and the left wing of the Labour Party as well, who were alarmed with German militarization and aggression and demanded action against him. Arguments against appeasement included Czechoslovakia and its border with Germany would have been really difficult for Germany to actually invade. The Czechoslovakian army was the only real fighting force in Eastern Europe at the time, and by giving it away, the Allies made it much easier for Hitler to expand east. Next, appeasement sent the clear message to Hitler that he could get away with a lot, and the Allies were afraid of him, and that generally is no good. And it gave Hitler time to strengthen his military. There is also the moral argument. Britain had signed away part of a country that didn't belong to Britain, and that it had promised to defend when that country was created. There was also this issue that, Hitler, when he wrote Mein Kampf back in the 1920s, he laid out his game plan pretty clearly, and it involved taking Eastern Europe. So the plan was there, and politicians could have and should have taken this more seriously. And finally, appeasement wasn't the only option. An alternative would have been to pursue an alliance with the Soviet Union and France early on, which may have discouraged Hitler from being aggressive, perhaps. Enforcing the Treaty of Versailles would also have deterred Hitler's aggression. But of course, they didn't do that. You might be wondering why this matters. The thing about appeasement, actually the thing about history generally, aside from giving us the occasional really cool story, is that mostly we study history so that we can learn from it to avoid making mistakes over and over and over. To do this, to learn from history, we compare similar events and situations to see if there are lessons there. Sometimes the lesson's really clear. For example, Napoleon tried to invade Russia in the winter. It went terribly. Hitler tried to invade Russia in the winter, the Soviet Union, that's coming up next. It went really badly too. So don't try to invade the Soviet Union in the winter is a pretty good lesson. Sometimes, though, people use history to make really simple arguments and bring up history in a way to use associations that we make with specific historical times and people as a substitute for providing any actual evidence for their argument. So by comparing analogous situations, it might seem like they're providing good reasons to support an opinion, but they're actually not. Here's an example. I'm sure some among you like puppies. Do you like puppies? I like puppies. Look at those puppies. They're cute. Decide whether or not you like puppies right now. You know who else likes puppies? Hitler loved puppies. So, according to my reasoning, you must be just like Hitler if you also like puppies. That's a terrible argument. The implication, though, is that if you have one thing in common with the man, then you must be similar in other ways, even though the context, everything about your life, and probably your moral outlook is different. This is a logical fallacy because the context really matters. You are not a bad person because you like puppies, and Hitler was a really, really bad person even though he liked puppies. As a side note, that's his dog. His dog's name was Blondie. Really, no joke. People use appeasement and the Munich conference as a simplistic argument all the time in politics. It's become a symbol not just of a fatal miscalculation, but of national weakness, of spineless appeasement, of an implacable expansionist enemy. The lesson here, or so the argument goes, is that the military price of stopping aggression was cheaper in 1938 than it was after World War II started, and that the strongest possible confrontation, therefore, is called for in similar cases. Failure to intervene to protect some target of aggression is to choose, as Churchill said, both dishonor and war. For some politicians, the Munich analogy, with its simplistic equation of like negotiating equals cowardice and weakness, became kind of a decision-making paradigm and a way to attack political opponents. So some people took the very simple and very fallacious idea that like, if you negotiate with an enemy, it is in all cases wrong. And if you start to pay attention to politics, you'll see this all over the place. Sometimes people use it to mean just talking to the enemy is necessarily wrong because appeasement failed before 1942. Real life and death decisions are made on the strength of this argument that appeasement equals World War II. And real life and death decisions are also made on terrible versions of this argument. So you should decide for yourself. What does the context tell us? Was appeasement a terrible mistake that allowed World War II to happen? Or was it a pragmatic decision at the time that allowed the Allies to build up strength to eventually win World War II? Or was something else the primary cause of World War II? Are there lessons to take from this? Or is the context so unique that we shouldn't apply the lessons of Munich to other cases? While you're thinking on that, pause here and take notes on appeasement and the outbreak of World War II.